세션 1은 디지털 전환 가속화와 국제규범의 형성이라는 주제로 발표와 토론이 준비가 되어 있습니다. 디지털 전환이 가속화됨에 따라서 WTO, 가츠로 대표되던 상품, 서비스 무역 규범의 이분법적 논의의 변화가 불가피하게 되었습니다. 세션 1에서는 디지털 교육의 다양한 이슈를 다루기 위해서 어떠한 논의 과정을 통해서 국제 규범을 형성해 나가고 있는지, 이 과정에서 중요하게 다뤄지고 있는 이슈는 무엇인지 살펴보는 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 패널 토론에 앞서서 연사분을 소개하겠습니다. Deborah Elms, 싱가포르 아시아무역센터 대표님께서 발제를 준비해 주셨는데요. 대표님은 과거 싱가포르 통상산업부 무역 아카데미 선임 연구원과 싱가포르 난양공과대학 국제정치경제학 선임 연구원을 역임하셨으며 현재 아시아 비즈니스 무역협회 회장직을 맡고 계십니다. 현장에 함께해 주셨죠? 그럼 바로 무대 위로 모셔보도록 하겠습니다. Deborah Elms, Founder and Executive Director of the Asian Trade Center, please come forward to the stage for your presentation. 네, 통역 서비스가 필요하신 분은 리시버 착용하시고 채널 1번 맞추시면 한국어로 서비스를 받으실 수가 있겠습니다. So please welcome her with a big round of applause. 여러분 박수로 맞이해 주십시오.
Thanks very much. It's an honor to be here, and it's a delight, frankly, to be in person. And so I want to thank all of you who are here, but not forget those who are also watching this online through the miracle, frankly, of digital services trade. So I think this is a great event that combines today's economy, which is both half in person and then half online. So I'm really happy to be here, and I'm delighted to follow the opening remarks that emphasize the importance of digital. What I've been asked to do in the next few minutes is go through some of the ways that our trade agreements in particular are dealing with these complicated issues of digital. Now, one thing I note at the outset is that lots of people say to me, well, why do we need to have any trade agreement that deals with digital trade? We had no trade agreements for a long time, and we all have digital trade. We all have, the internet in your pocket. You're all online all the time. So what do we need a trade agreement for? And I think the problem for companies is that while it sounds often like no rules is a great idea, if you're a company dealing with no rules, that's actually very stressful because there's a lot of risk and a lot of uncertainty that comes from having no rules at all. And increasingly, we have governments who are excited about digital trade regulation, and they are starting to regulate trade in digital in different ways. And so this becomes a real problem for companies because now they have to deal with restrictions in one market that's different from another market, and that incoherence is a nightmare. It's hard for large companies, but large companies have lots of money and resources, so they can throw hundreds of people at the project and solve problems. But it is really bad if you're a small firm. So if you're a small firm and you're trying to engage in digital trade across a border and you have inconsistent regulations, your business could be completely at risk. So it's a real problem to have this growing inconsistency. And so how are we solving that? Well, as you've heard and you will hear again for the rest of the day, it would be awesome if we had an international system that was functioning properly. And if we had members, all of the members coming together to create a consistent set of digital trade rules, that is not happening. Happily, we sit in Asia, and here in Asia, we have governments that understand why digital trade matters and have been enthusiastically signing all kinds of different digital trade rule arrangements to make sure that digital trade flourishes now and into the future. So there are multiple ways they do this, and I'll talk about a few of them. Now, this is not new. We've been doing digital trade in a lot of different ways in Asia for a while. An early one, for example, from 2010 between Australia, New Zealand, and ASEAN had an e-commerce chapter that was pretty good, actually, in the digital world, 2010 feels like a very long time ago. There are other bilateral agreements that have lots of digital rules. Those of you who work in the region may know ASEAN has been working on digital trade for a while, and RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, has a chapter. It's an awful chapter, but it has a chapter on digital trade. We talked about the WTO, and we'll talk about it more in a minute. We talk about the TPP, which is now the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Korea is not a member, but you should be, so hopefully, fingers crossed, you will be in TPP soon. And in the meantime, you would have more digital rules. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that was mentioned this morning is negotiating right now. We'll see whether that sees the light of day, but there are a lot of work in there that is supposed to be ahead on digital. And the latest innovation, and I think Korea has done a great job, is being part of these digital-only agreements, both the digital economy agreements, like the one that was signed between Korea and Singapore, and also the DEPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, which is a standalone digital deal. So I'll talk about these in a little bit more detail. I want to make one more comment before we get too far down into digital trade, and that is, when we talk about digital trade, it's increasingly hard to pull out what is digital trade from what is trade. Increasingly, I would argue that all trade is digital. It's digitally developed, it's digitally enabled, it's digitally delivered. If you are purely somehow not in an offline world, you have a problem. So increasingly, all trade is digital trade. So then you might say, well, that's a bit weird. Why are we making these separate digital trade agreements when we have trade agreements? And it's one of the reasons why I think it's important to think hard about the connection between regular trade, whatever that looks like, and then digital trade, whatever we call that. And particularly for trade agreements, we tend to say, well, the e-commerce chapter is the thing that covers digital. But remember that that's not all the digital parts that we see in a trade deal. It's also anything related to services, including telecommunications and financial services. It's chapters on investment, the stuff about data specifically, intellectual property rights for the digital age, standards in digital, small businesses, development. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in a trade agreement that's actually about digital, even if it doesn't say the word digital. And as we plan for the future, and I know I have a lot of students in the room, so as you start to become part of the policymaking community, remember that it's not just about the e-commerce chapter that you need to pay attention. It's the whole suite of things. And the goal ought to be, in my view, to allow what we used to call a micro-multinational to be able to find markets, suppliers, customers anywhere in the world. You know, you could sit in your living room and you could become a global player. And I think that ought to be the goal that we try to anchor into these various digital agreements. So what are we trying to do then when we have a digital agreement? It depends on the format, but there's a few key goals that I think are important. Some of them have been mentioned and they keep coming up, but you actually have to deliver them. So one of them is paperless trading. One of the things that COVID showed us, there's a lot of things that COVID showed us, but one thing that COVID showed us was that while cargo in e-commerce moved with difficulty because of restrictions on the border, the paper that you needed to accompany like a shipment on a boat couldn't move because that was often sent on aircraft and aircraft couldn't move, and so we discovered all sorts of problems actually with getting the piece of paper attached to the shipment to arrive at the same time and be delivered. So this is stupid, frankly. In 2022, we should be able to have those documentation delivered online. We don't need to fill up aircraft and fly pieces of paper around. This is insane. So paperless trading, it doesn't need to be just a sort of, something you say, but it's actually something you do. Now, it's hard to do, of course, that's why it's taking so long, but it's important. The same thing is true with electronic signatures and electronic authorization. It is insane that you, in a digital world, have to print out a PDF and sign the thing with a wet ink signature and then hand it to somebody. So can we move to actually allowing electronic signatures and electronic authorization? Can we do things to actually move logistics, especially for small size, small value shipments? So not a 40-foot container, but someone who's trying to sell, one shirt. So how can we make that a bit more seamless? Electronic payments is a nightmare. It works very well domestically, especially in a market like Korea, where you don't even realize you have an issue. But sometimes the cross-border payment part is still very difficult and expensive, especially if you're small business. So dealing with electronic payments is important. We're worried increasingly about consumer protection in the online space. We have a lot of our governments in this region that have no offline consumer protection. So you can imagine if you don't have it offline, then you also don't have it online. And actually that's a problem because all of you, I'm sure whoever bought something, have had a little worry in the back of your head. What if I don't like it? What if it's the wrong one? What if it's counterfeit? What if whatever. What if it arrives broken? So trying to think about online consumer protection is super important, especially, and this gets complicated, cross-border. You order from, Thailand and it arrives, now what? Ugh. So we have to think about how we're going to deal with these issues in the digital space, as well as the obvious ones on, for example, cross-border data flows, managing personal information. How we deal with these new technologies. Korea's at the forefront of a lot of them. You have excellent firms and have been doing a great job. But not everyone has the same domestic level rules as Korea for some of these new and emerging technologies. And if we don't get consistency, it could be hard for Korean firms to grow because they would end up building systems for rules that are incompatible in a new market. So you have to think about how we're going to manage that coordination. And all of that, I would say, requires regular engagement with stakeholders. And I think one thing that Korea does very well is this kind of multi-audience event, which is important because otherwise we're trying to regulate or make rules for the digital economy, and we often have government officials who have never themselves actually, managed successfully to attach a PDF. So that's always a problem. You need to make sure that business is talking to government in a way that is consistent, otherwise we get really bad rules. So all of these agreements are different, and they're different for lots of reasons. One of them has to do with timing, right? If you had an older agreement, and again, in the digital space, old means 10 years old, say. Some of those are cooperation only, some of those are because nobody knew what to do. So we have some differences between agreements because of the age. Newer ones do more exciting things than older ones. Sometimes it's who are you talking to? People that you've worked with regularly, you feel more trust, you work together more cooperatively, which is why like Korea and Singapore managed to do pretty comprehensive, deep integration in their bilateral agreement that they just signed. So that makes it easier than if you have a large group of countries. So the bottom line really, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, is that there's lots of ways to get where we want to go. But what we would really like is to have greater consistency and all different approaches that we're all sort of headed in the same general direction, because otherwise, again, we have this fragmented, messy world that doesn't fit digital well and creates real problems for all of us. There are a couple of issues I want to mention as well, and then I will turn to how we work with government on this. Some of these issues are not yet in a trade agreement, and some of you, especially the students in the room, can think creatively about how this might get done. We have the digital divide continues to widen. It's not such an issue here in Korea, thankfully, because I think you've done a great job. But that's why I think Korea should be a model for others, because this digital divide actually matters. It's part of what blocks governments from being cooperative in the future is their worries and their fears about what might happen. So if you're not out there helping those who are less digitally online than you are, then that's a problem. The payment thing I talked about is a real challenge, so sorting that one out is a big one. A new one that's coming that's not in a trade agreement yet is something about tax and digital trade. So I do trade, and I've always had the luxury of being able to say, tax, not my problem. Tax, go talk to somebody else, the OECD people, let them deal with it. I don't deal with tax. In the digital world, though, we actually start to have to deal with tax. How do you deal with digital services tax, and especially cross-border application of VAT or GST plus digital services taxes? That is a nightmare. Now I got to be registered in a country where I might sell services, and I got to pay taxes in a local currency. Oh, this is a nightmare. So thinking about what that looks like, I think, is going to be important for trade. We have lots of worries now about data or digital sovereignty, especially here in Asia, where that argument is starting to resonate and be a problem. So you have to think about that. Competition policy is growing, especially for a lot of our larger companies who are at risk of being caught. And while you think you're regulating for a large company, the implication is actually felt on often all of the very small providers who are using that digital platform to do whatever it is that they do. So you have to think about that. The new tech is a big challenge, especially for government officials who really, some of them, not all of them. Thankfully, Koreans are actually quite advanced in this, but I will tell you that if you talk to Asian trade officials about digital, you will get conversations like this, where they say, they look out a window and they go, I don't understand how my data is in that cloud. And then you think, oh my goodness, you are the one developing the rules for this, and you're looking in the literal cloud for your data. we have a problem. So we need to think hard about how we explain what these new technologies are, how they work to government officials who are regulating them, right? How do we make that make sense? Very challenging. And the speed is a problem. So get it, because business is continuously innovating, government is very slow. So how do we manage to merge those two? Can be a real challenge. And then my last slide that I just want to talk about before I finish this session right now is about how do we help government then as a result. I think this is a great start, right? Because we have government and industry together. I think this kind of thing happens fairly regularly in Korea, which is very helpful. But it would be nice if we did it in lots of other places, and crucially, if we had, as an example, Korean businesses working with other governments in the region to help educate, help inform, help build a story about how we can create digital agreements in different ways that ultimately satisfy the needs of all of us. I think that would be great. A lot of these trade agreements that we have that we're very excited about, the digital economy agreements, DEPA, et cetera, they're supposed to be run by committees, but those committees have never met. So it's great to say you're going to join something. That's awesome. But you actually have to meet in order to do something. You have to implement the agreement. And so one thing that I think is super important is that business and academia and think tanks remind everybody of what were the commitments, what's not yet been done, what needs to be done, how can we help us all create actual policy rather than just an agreement. And if at all possible, business needs to keep talking, always talk to government about what is it that is and isn't working about the existing rules. What's missing, what are the gaps, what's working well, so that government has a sense of what they should be doing. And otherwise, the government doesn't really know most of the time. Like they're not, it makes sense, right? They're not in the business of making digital things, digital services, digital goods, et cetera. So they don't know these things. So if you're not actually having a regular conversation with them, it's a real problem. So I think that this interaction between government and business and academia, that sort of ecosystem, is absolutely critical to solving the problems that we're going to have in the digital economy. Because at the end of the day, if we can't make digital trade work, then we can't make trade work. So we have to be working a lot harder than we have been about how do we unblock obstacles to digital trade, digital delivery of goods and services, investment, et cetera, and how do we coordinate rather than fragment as we do that. So the good news, and this is my last sentence, I think, the good news is that here in Asia, we're doing a better job of it than lots of other parts of the world where they're going in different directions. But that doesn't mean that you should sort of sit back and relax, because we need to get it right here, and then we need to help explain why that works, why it works for all of us in Asia, and then why it works for the larger communities as well. So I'm delighted to be here in Korea today to talk to all of you, and to have this kind of session with this level of attendance I think is fantastic. And really looking forward to more conversations about this across the rest of this afternoon. So thank you very much.
네, 모두 자리해 주셨습니다. 세션 1 토론은 이한영 중앙대학교 교수님께서 맡아주시겠는데요. 교수님은 과거 외교부 한미 FTA 자문단 자문위원으로 활동하셨고요. 현재 산업부 통상교섭 민간자문위원과 과비부 이 방송통신발전기금 운용심의회 위원을 맡고 계십니다. 이한영 교수님, 이제 진행을 부탁드리겠습니다.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the panel discussion of the first session. I'm Professor Han-young Lee from Jungwon University in Korea. I'm so delighted to have the opportunity to moderate the session. There are two key words never to be left out in the buzzword game these days. They are what I consider to be digital transformation and digital trade. Digital transformation is providing us with more and more chances to engage in international trade than ever before. The door is wide open for firms, particularly for micro, small, and medium-sized governments, and even consumers. Enabled by digital, goods and services cross the border easily and efficiently. A tremendous amount of data is coming and going in borderless digital space. Such a new shape of trade, so-called digital trade, is posing chances, challenges, and even threats to citizens, firms, and governments around the world. And we are fighting our way through tons of distressing problems. This session along the line is to assess the state of play in developing prototype rules for digital trade and to map out the steps we need to take for the forward-looking digital trade framework. Today we are joined by terrific experts. They are ready to share with us their expertise, experience, and insight on the agenda today. I believe the audience is as excited as I am about our quality panel. The speaker, Dr. Elms, continued to stay with us throughout the session. Our first discussant will be Dr. Martin Roy. He has come a long way from Geneva, I guess. You might suffer from jet lag still. We owe him a special thanks for that. Our second discussant will be Professor Peng Shin-yi, if I pronounced it correctly, from Taiwan,
Yes.
National Tsinghua University. She has served as a commissioner of the National Communications Commission of Taiwan. And she is over there, is sitting us with over the internet. Attorney Ju-hyung Lee, will be our third and final discussant. Holding PhD, she is practicing law at Kim & Jang, a leading law firm in Korea. Her research focus is on digital trade and trade aspects on standards and technical regulation. I would like to thank all the panel members for taking the time to attend this session. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a warm welcome for our panel members. Now allow me to briefly outline the ground rules for panel discussion. At the beginning, I will ask each discussant one by one in the order I just introduced to make comments or raise questions, if any, on the Dr. Elms' presentation for 7 minutes or so. Thereafter, we will listen to around 5-minute response from the speaker all at once. And in the available time, we will hold Q&A session with audience. Finally, I never want to miss mentioning one substantive matter. As you see in the conference program, session 2 will also discuss digital trade, but in detail, to avoid overlapping discussions between the sessions. I would like each panel member, as much as possible, to draw a big picture rather than try to touch details. Let me add particularly, for the sake of time, 2 more lines to housekeeping rulebook. 1, I will save my voice, if I can, until my closing remarks. 2, if I feel necessary, I will go back and forth speaking between English and Korean. Well, without further ado, let me get right on panel discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, let's see what Dr. Roy has to say. Please, Dr. Roy.
Thank you, moderator. That's a lot of rules that I'll try to follow, not digital rules, but rules I'll try to follow. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Kita and the ministry for organizing this. It's a very important event. Let me just offer a few remarks. Deborah's presentation was very comprehensive. What I wanted to do in commenting was to touch on two particular aspects, and then maybe invite some questions or follow-up from our main speaker here. The first aspect I wanted to highlight was a bit of the background to these efforts to search for improved rules at the global level in RTAs and in other places, which is, what is really providing the incentive for governments to do that. And the incentive for governments really comes in the way that digital technologies have transformed world trade. This was certainly accelerated by the COVID pandemic. It certainly did not start with that. These trends were well underway, but in some markets more than others, it really provided a big impetus also, an additional one, for governments to really pay more attention and to engage in efforts to adapt or enhance existing rules on trade. The pandemic has really brought a lot of new people online for the first time. A lot of consumers have gone online for the first time, especially in lower income developing countries. We estimate that, or the ITU estimates that almost 800 million people have been brought online since 2019. So this is really, increasing the importance of digital ways of doing business. But it's not only that new people are increasingly going online, it's also that, especially with the pandemic, new habits were created on the part of consumers, that even though they did shop and buy online, consume online, they did so a lot more during the pandemic. And businesses also invested to a greater extent to expand their online activities. Even those companies that were not doing most of their business digitally, they expanded to develop these new aspects. And so these developments have really affected trade in very significant ways. It has digital technologies really bring down the cost of trade, so the trade cost, makes it easier to access foreign markets, especially for smaller enterprises, makes it easier to integrate into supply chain, and it really provides a lot of new opportunities for export for firms in different sectors and different levels. The other aspect I wanted to touch on, and also invite Deborah's views on that, is what is going on in the WTO. So of course, now most of the efforts, as pointed out in the presentation, has been at the regional level where agreements have been concluded. In the WTO, there's a few strands of work that are taking place, one of which is on negotiating to improve existing rules in the WTO, specifically targeting digital trade. This is taking place in the context of what we call the Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce, where 87 WTO members are now engaged in negotiations to develop this new agreement or set of rules on digital trade. Good progress have been made in a relatively short period of time by WTO standards. This started in 2018. And so far, and this involves most of the main trading economies, with few exceptions, but all the bigger trading economies are involved. And this deals with all the panoply of issues that are found in regional trade agreements and that focus on digital trade. There has been convergence already among all these members, and that's not something easy to do, on a number of articles and issues, which you will also see in regional trade agreements: e-signatures, e-authentication, e-contracts, paperless trading, online consumer protection. So for all members to have in place a framework to ensure the protection of consumers online. So to all agree that they should have some standards in place. The WTO is not a standard-setting organization, but you would have obligations like that that would set in place basic rules for online consumer protection. And so in a few other issues, 7 in total, 2 or 3 more that are well advanced. So already good progress has been achieved in these negotiations. A lot more remains to be discussed. These discussions or negotiations cover all the topics that relate to digital trade. Now, of course, in the end, we'll have to see what this large group of members actually manage to agree on. There's still a number of important issues that are being discussed, such as rules for free data flows, rules on localization of computing facilities, so rules that really target not so much regulatory frameworks, but that target barriers to digital trade. This still has to be agreed by participating members. So a few challenges remain, of course. The more difficult issues are always left to the end, but this is really, and I would like to hear Deborah's views on what might be some of the particular challenges in that regard. But this really shows an effort of WTO members to respond to these fundamental changes that are happening at the economic level, to try to adapt and keep the system as relevant as it can be. And Korea is indeed well placed to, given the high level of digital connectivity, to lead and participate in a very effective manner in these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goy. To my understanding, you raised 2 interesting points. One is digital trade is a good chance for almost everyone. And second is WTO making efforts to standardize those rules, including consumer protection, paperless trading, electronic signature, that sort of thing. Okay, and it's kind of more of a question. Second part is more of a question raised to Dr. Elms, and we will get back to it later. Okay. And next one is Professor Peng. We are lucky to host her because her recent research focus is on data governance. And that is critical for digital trade. Professor Peng, what is your position on that issue? Please.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction, and I would like to thank the organizer for having me. It's a great pleasure to share this panel with all the experts. I'm sorry that I cannot attend the event in person due to some obligations in my university. And following the remarks made by the keynote speaker, Dr. Endagang, and my colleague panelist, let me try to quickly respond to the overarching questions of this panel. And I would like to discuss the digital trade issues from the angle of, as the moderator mentioned, data governance. And I would like to focus on the question of how private sectors can fill the gap. And then perhaps more generally, how private sector actors can contribute to data governance. Indeed, as digital trade expands, governments are facing, I would say, dilemmas between, on the one hand, maximizing digital opportunities by speeding up the digital transformation, and on the other hand, trying to manage the impact of the cross-border data flows for other policy objectives, such as privacy and cybersecurity. And that being said, in the context of international trade agreements, I think an obvious challenge is the inherent sensitivities of interfering with other parties' sovereign right, I mean digital sovereignty. And as my colleagues panelists have pointed out, there are a different kind of digital trade provisions in the free trade agreement. And I would like to say that particular attention should be paid to some soft legal language. I mean, the soft legal nature of several digital trade provisions under the free trade agreement. For example, in some FTAs, parties often merely recognize the importance or endeavor to comply with some digital trade rules. So I'm of the view that standard of such a soft law nature can provide greater flexibility to address the industry-specific issues and adapt to the rapidly changing technological and even political landscape. The reality is that the trend of digital sovereignty is increasing. So in future trade negotiations, I would say it might be necessary to leave the key concept undefined to allow for policy alternatives. And in this regard, I would like to stress the possible role for private sector to contribute to data governance. Maybe let's focus on data privacy and security, which are among the biggest challenges for regulators among all the issues associated with digital trade or digital technologies. In terms of privacy protection, in the age of big data, the concept of de-identification is increasingly central technique that is being used for big data application, which means that we need to remove details from the information that make it possible to recognize which particular person the information is connected with, right? So in practice, how to better manage the risk of data being used to identify a natural person requires sectoral technical standards. Therefore, private sectors such as the certification body or industry associations with necessary technical expertise can carry out all the de-identification, re-identification assessment, and they can help the government to maintain the anonymization and reduce the risk of re-identification. And very similarly, in terms of cybersecurity, the development of technical standards requires, of course, timely action. And the involvement of both public and private sectors has proven to be more efficient approach. So procedurally, the concept of co-governance has increasingly been advocated, considering that the technological development is actually in control of the industry. I think the collaborative approach might be sensible. So my point is that looking together, co-regulation will fulfill an important role in the big data ecosystem. And if I still have a little bit of time, I would like to follow the instruction of the moderator and raise one question for Dr. Deborah Elms. And of course, Dr. Roy Martin and Dr. Lee are welcome to comment or respond. Deborah, in your presentation, you at the end of your presentation, you mentioned the digital divide issue. I think which is very important. And I share of your viewpoints, and my stand is that the asymmetry nature of the global digital economy points to the need to strike a balance between digital efficiency and digital inclusion. And as you pointed out, that one primary challenge facing the ongoing WTO e-commerce talk is the allegation that maybe in some cases the proposed digital trade rules like e-invoicing will benefit the big tech companies at the expense of the workers or the small businesses, which will hurt the developing country. In this regard, I would like to hear more of your insights. Is there any experiences or lessons we can learn from the free trade agreement? Thank you. I think I should stop here for the first round.
Okay. Professor Peng underlined several points. First is pros and cons of free data flow across the border, and the necessity of flexibility in drafting trade agreements on digital. And the third one is what I consider to be standardization and conformance assessment related to de-identification. Okay, and the final point is a question given to Dr. Elms that is related with digital device, and particularly the question is how to balance between different commercial values or interest. Am I right?
Yes. Just, is there any lessons we can learn from the free trade agreement to address the digital divide in international trade agreement? Yes.
Okay, so you stressed on the lessons from previous FTAs, right?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Now, 이제 잠깐 이제 우리말 하겠습니다. 예. 그 이주영 변호사님이 이제 유일한 한국인이신데요. 오래 기다려 주셔서 고맙고요. 그 앞서 이제 발표자 토론자들 중에서 자주 디지털 무역 관련 규제 또 통상 규범의 프래그멘테이션 분절화 이런 거를 많이들 이제 우려를 하셨어요. 그래서 이제 이 부분에 대해서 이 변호사님께서 이제 향후에 이 전망이 그 어떨지에 대해서 이제 진단을 간단히 해주시면 좋겠고요. 그다음에 이제 패널 토론자 중에서 이제 유일한 한국인이기 때문에 우리 정부에도 뭐 이렇게 도움이 될 만한 얘기 있으시면 한마디 이제 제언해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
네, 안녕하세요. 저 김앤장의 이주영 변호사라고 합니다. 예, 아까 소개시켜 주신 것처럼 이제 디지털 통상 관련된 그 분야 논문을 써서 박사이고 이 분야 업무도 하고 이제 그리고 연구도 계속하고 있는데요. 오늘 이제 저희 그 대부분 이제 청중들이 한국 분이셔서 한국어로 진행해 달라는 말씀 미리 전달받아서 한국어로 답변 드리고자 합니다. 일단 데보라 웰럼스 우리 그 센터장님 이번에 발표 정말 되게 의미가 있는데 그 중에 이제 몇 개를 추려서 제 코멘트도 섞어서 하고 그리고 몇 가지 이제 질문도 마지막으로 드리고자 합니다. 일단 우리 데보라 웰럼스 센터장님 말씀하신 것처럼 이 디지털 어그리먼트에 대한 프래그멘테이션이 전 세계적으로 진행되는 것이 맞습니다. 그러니까 사실은 우리나라 같은 경우에도요 보시면은 그러니까 우리나라가 진짜 최근 들어서 민법 개정안을 발표를 했습니다. 민법 개정안이 어떤 부분이냐면 이 디지털 콘텐츠 계약법을 새로 이제 도입을 하는 거에 대해서 사실 입법 예고를 했는데요. 이 부분 같은 경우는 사실은 이제 저희가 우리 디지털 콘텐츠 관련된 건 사실은 일일이 만나서 계약서 주고받고 그러지 않잖아요. 보통 약관으로 대신하잖아요. 약관으로 대신하다 보니까 소비자 보호에 부족해지는 거예요. 그래서 이 부분 때문에 사실은 온라인 콘텐츠 제공자로 하여금 일정한 수준 이상의 그 콘텐츠를 제공하도록 하는 의무를 부과하고, 그리고 이 부분에 대한 일종의 그 담보 책임을 2년간 하자 담보 책임을 지도록 하는 그러한 그 내용이 들어 있고, 그리고 사실은 또 디지털 콘텐츠를 이용하는 이용자 입장에서는 이 디지털 콘텐츠를 이용하고 난 다음에 계약 기간이 끝난 다음에는 사실은 이 디지털 콘텐츠는 내가 가지고 있으면 계속 쓸 수도 있잖아요. 그래서 그 이후에는 사용을 하지 못하도록 하는 그러한 부분이 사실 민법 개정안으로 들어갔습니다. 이게 우리나라뿐만이 아니라 독일 같은 경우에도 2021년도에 독일 민법이 개정이 돼서 올해 1월 1일부터 시행됐습니다. 이 독일 민법에도 사실은 독일 민법은 EU의 그 유럽연합의 지침에 따라서 이 디지털 컨텐츠 관련된 계약 부분이 계약 총칙으로 들어갔고요. 이 그 비단 민법뿐만이 아닙니다. 지난주에도 저희 그 국회에서 많은 법들이 이 전자상거래나 디지털 무역 관련된 법들이 굉장히 많이 본회의를 통과했는데요. 제일 대표적으로 방송혁신 발전 기본법 같은 경우에는 우리 얼마 전에 문제가 되었던 일정 규모 이상의 부가통신 사업자들로 하여금 소위 말해서 서버를 한 군데 두고 있다 보니까 이 서버에 예를 들면 뭐 화재가 있다든지 여러 가지 문제점이 있을 때 이 위험에 대비하기 위해서 이것을 분산시키는 그런 것 관련된 이 개정안이 이미 국회 본회의를 통과했습니다. 사실은 이 정도로 우리나라뿐만 아니라 전 세계적으로 이 디지털 관련된 그 법안들이 우후죽순 사실은 생기고 있어서 이 부분에 있어서 우리 데보라 엘럼스 그 센터장님이 말씀하신 것처럼 통일성이 부족해지는 그런 문제점이 사실은 등장을 하고 있습니다. 그래서 향후에 사실은 이 디지털 이제 저희는 이제 국내부 규범뿐만 아니라 이것을 국제적으로 해서 일관성을 있게 하기 위한 디지털 무역 규범을 이제 만들자라는 게 최근 들어서 이슈인데, 이 부분 관련돼서 몇 가지 형식적인 면과 내용적인 면에 있어서 나눠서 말씀드리고자 합니다. 첫 번째 형식적인 부분에 있어서는 소위 말하는 섹터 스페시픽한 그런 그 협정이 등장하고 있다라고 말씀드릴 수가 있습니다. 저희 FTA 같은 경우에는 대표적으로 한EU FTA에서 TBT 챕터가 있습니다. 거기에 안엑스가 여러 개 붙어 있었고요. 안엑스에 예를 들면 화학이라든지 자동차라든지 이렇게 소위 말하는 섹터 스페시픽한 TBT들이 들어가는 것들이 최근에 FTA 후반부에 FTA에 있어서 점점 등장하기 시작했는데요. 이것을 사실은 발전시켜서 이 부분을 아예 별도의 협정으로 떼는 겁니다. 근데 별도의 협정으로 이렇게 떼서 디지털 무역 에 대한 그 협정들이 최근 등장하고 있고, 뭐 제일 대표적으로 이렇게 섹터 스페시픽한 거는 뭐 예를 들면 환경, 그래서 싱가포르 호주 그린 이코노미 어그리먼트 이런 것들도 대표적인 섹터 스페시픽한 그런 협정들이 최근 등장하고 있는 게 형식적인 특징입니다. 두 번째로 이게 트리티 베이스로 해가지고는 계속 될 것인가에 대해서 되게 의문점이 많습니다. 왜냐하면 사실 저희 WTO의 이제 개혁 문제가 계속 나오고 있는 그런 그 이유는 WTO는 소위 말하는 리걸 포지티비즘, 법실증주의에 따라서 굉장히 이 그 WTO의 그 소스 오브 로를 굉장히 제한적으로 해석을 한다든지 이것을 넓히자라는 그 여러 가지 그런 그 논의들이 많이 있었습니다. 그런 차원에서 사실은 앞으로의 이 디지털 무역 협정은 반드시 정말로 트리티 베이스로 해서 리걸리 바인딩한 그런 인스트루먼트로 갈 것인가에 대해서는 굉장히 많은 그 의문들이 있고, 그런 차원에서는 사실은 듀얼로 갈 것 같습니다. 굉장히 소프트로적인 측면에서 제일 대표적으로 EU 재팬 디지털 파트너십 같은 경우도 이게 어그리먼트한 리걸리 바인딩한 형태가 아닙니다. 그리고 저희 그 대파 같은 경우에는 이번 우리나라 정부도 가입을 하려고 하는데 이게 사실은 리걸리 바인딩 한 어그리먼트로 되어 있지만 모듈 형식으로 해서 선택적으로 취사 선택을 할 수 있다는 점에서 기존에 우리가 알고 있는 리걸리 바인딩한 그 국제적인 트리티하고는 조금 또 다른 그런 측면이 있습니다. 그래서 그런 측면과, 그리고 정말로 강력하게 예를 들면은 미국이라든지 일본이라든지 많은 그 디지털 온라인 플랫폼들을 가지고 있는 기업들을 가지고 있는 강국들은 뭐 예를 들면 데이터 트랜스퍼라든지 아니면 로컬 컴퓨팅 퍼실리티스 관련된 그 강제 금지 규정이라든지 규범이라든지 이런 규정에 대해서는 굉장히 강력한 의무 규범을 병행을 하려는 그런 의도들이 보이고 있고요. 그리고 다음으로 내용적인 측면을 말씀드리고자 합니다. 내용적인 측면에 있어서는 사실은 저희가 굉장히 다양한, 그러니까 저희는 예전에 WTO 규범은 원칙, 그래서 비차별 대우라든지 페어 트레이드라든지 이런 것들에 대한 원칙이 있고 여기에 대한 제너럴 익셉션이 있었는데 사실은 이 부분이 오히려 혼용되거나 아니면 익셉션 부분이 오히려 이 원칙을 뛰어넘는 그런 부분들이 디지털 무역 규범에 있어서 많이 발견이 되고 있습니다. 그래서 사실은 과거에 근데 그게 이제 non discrimination principle로 통용화되던 그 대표적인 그 중점적인 무역 규범이 이제 디지털 무역 규범으로 와서는 되게 다양한 형태로 나타나고 있는 것이죠. 데이터 이동이라든지 컴퓨팅 서버 설치 금지라든지 이런 것들도 사실은 모양은 그런 규정이지만 기본적인 근저에는 non discrimination principle의 그런 그 정신을 가지고 있다. 그래서 소위 말하는 레벨 플레잉 필드를 기업들에게 제공하기 위한 그런 규범들이 나오고 있다라고 말씀을 드릴 수가 있고요. 그리고 그 다음으로 그리고 마지막으로 저희 디지털 포용 관련된 그런 사실은 무역 측면뿐만이 아니라 비무역적인 이슈들도 많이 등장을 할 것 같습니다. 그래서 한국도 사실은 2021년에 디지털 포용법이 발효돼서 디지털 포용위원회라든지 이런 것들을 통해서 취약계층을 보호하자라고 하는 그런 내용이 등장을 하고 있는데 영국, 싱가포르 디지털 무역 협정이라든지 이런 데서는 노동권이라든지 양질의 일자리까지 언급한 디지털 포용 법안이 등장하고 있어서 앞으로 주목을 끌 것 같습니다. 그래서 마지막으로 저희 데보라 웰럼스 저희 센터장님께 하나 질문을 드리고 싶은데 우리 센터장님 저기 발표 자료에서 컴퍼티션 관련된 이야기를 하셨고 사실은 컴퍼티션이야말로 최근에 각국이 우후죽순으로 국내법을 막 만들고 있어서 가장 프래그멘테이션이 심한 분야입니다. 근데 그 부분이 사실은 컨시스턴시를 디지털 무역으로 이룰까에 대해서는 많은 그 사람들이 의문을 가지고 있습니다. 그래서 이 부분에 대한 우리 데보라 저기 박사님의 의견을 듣고 싶습니다. 이상입니다.
I think the question raised by Dr. Lee Ju-hyung is the toughest one in this panel discussion. Okay, it's time to listen to speaker's response. Dr. Elm, please. You have 5 minutes.
Thanks. 5 minutes is tough. So let me try to summarize a few of these things. I mean, it would be nice if we could come up with a clear, unified theory that deals with all things related to digital that worked in all of the markets at the same time. That would be awesome. That's not going to happen. So what we need to do is be, I think, very practical about this. What can you do? What can you do in different settings? And as much as possible, can we get consistency and alignment? That's how I mean, because I'm ultimately very practical person. So how can we do that? Well, one way is to design rules using whatever format works that, again, that have similar kinds of content, that have similar kinds of scope, that go in the same general direction. Now, this is very dissatisfying for lawyers in particular who don't like this kind of flexibility, but I think reality is we need to have a certain amount of flexibility in order to get where we're going, and you see that in the fragmentation that we have, even in the approaches that we have, from 86 or 87 members at the JSI who are working on this, to regional groupings, to bilateral conversations. Each one is slightly different from the other. Now, I can argue that that's a bad idea, but I think that's the reality that we live in at the moment. So the goal for me is to minimize the gaps and to ensure sort of consistency. And for me, the sort of touchstone, how do we get this to work? The more you can relate this to a practical problem, the better, I think. So here's an example. If you talk to regulators, and they will say to you, there is a clear difference in data between who controls the data and who processes the data, right? There's clear distinction. And we need to not move personal data, or we need to move personal data only in certain ways. And we need to not move financial data or move financial data in certain ways, all of which makes a lot of sense. Then you say, what happens if you're a small company and you want to sell a jacket from my market to yours? Guess what? I need your personal data. I need to know who you are. I need an address. I need to move financial data because I need to know your credit card, your bank account details. I need to at least know your WhatsApp number if I'm doing some fintech thing. I'm moving personal data, I'm moving financial data. And if you say, well, you can't do that, then you've just stopped trade. And you've particularly stopped trade for smaller firms. And you've made it super complicated. So I think, I understand the incentive, especially lawyers and some trade policy practitioners and big companies that like to think about all the details and the complexity. But if it doesn't work for small businesses and it doesn't work for consumers, then what is the point? Let me give you another example. You guys haven't had to fly to Korea lately, I'm guessing. And you're not subject to this wretched form, this KETA, this Korean Electronic Transit Authorization form. It's a nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare of a form. It took me an hour to fill it out. I missed a flight. My last flight to Korea I missed because I didn't have this form filled out, because it needs a whole lot of things. But one thing it starts with is, like, I swear to you, 6 pages of consent. You can't get the form that you need to get on a plane if you don't say agree to all. So I say to you, what is the point? What is the point of asking me whether I consent when you're not going to let me get on the plane if I don't consent? So I think sometimes we just have to think about this realistically. If we're asking for consent and you're allowed to opt out and still get on the plane, maybe that's one thing. In this case, it's an automatic. I either accept it or I don't. And if I don't accept it, I don't get on the plane. What is the point? So it would be nice if, when we create these rules, these obligations, we thought harder about what does that mean in the real world? What does that mean crucially for me, for small businesses who are trying to survive, and for customers who are trying to get by in a digitally enabled world? And if we're creating more obstacles than we're solving, then we should really rethink this. And so this is not necessarily a solution to these problems, but I really wish that we had a little bit more practicality on some of these before we create unnecessarily complicated rules that ultimately destroy the possibility of my micro multinational becoming successful. So this is not easy. It's not easy. But then if we'd sat here in 1945 or whenever it was, pre-World Trade Organization, pre-GATT, we probably would have said the same thing about trade. We would have probably all sat around and said, well, it's super difficult to get trade and goods back and forth and have some kind of system that would do it and that we could all agree on. We would have said there's no way in heck that we could do that, and here we are all these decades later, it's working. I think we're at the early stages on some of these digital issues, but my plea would be, can we please focus on these more practical things when we are creating these big ideas, and try as much as possible to ensure consistency at the end of the day. There will have to be some flexibility at the beginning because we're not sure what the right rules should be. We don't know what the consequences of many of these rules will be. We imagine what we think is going to happen, and then someone gets hold of these rules and they have a loophole or they have some obstacle that was created. And so I think we just have to be realistic about this. But we need as much as possible to keep the conversation going. And that conversation needs to be between governments in whatever format it needs to be. Doesn't have to result in a trade deal, but we need to constantly have them discussing with each other. And then crucially, we need companies especially, but we could also need academics or lawyers or think tanks or whatever else to be part of that conversation as well, to say what rules make sense. What rules make sense for today? What rules do we think might make sense for tomorrow? What are areas where we don't need a rule right now? We don't know what the rules should be. Let's not make one. Let's wait and see what happens. And then if we have a problem, we could solve something around it. So I think there just needs to be a bit more sort of continuing effort on this. And in some cases, it will be slow. So the JSI initiative, I know you think it's blazing fast, 5 years for the beginning of a conversation where we might possibly have something in 7 areas, and we might think about some other areas. But as a business, they're out of business. They've tipped over and gone under in the time that it's taking you to get some alignment around 7 general ideas. So I think, the speed is an issue. We will have rules in some areas before we have rules in others. And I think that's okay in the end, because I think that's how it's going to have to go.
Okay. Thank you so much. And I just one comment. I think the question raised by 이주영 변호사님 is not fully answered. But my suggestion is you might want to look at Digital Market Act by European Union, then you will find some hint about your question. Okay?
Can I just intervene again and say, great, think about that from the perspective of a small business. If you're a Korean company and you're producing goods or services increasingly, and you're exporting them, which Korean companies do, and everyone starts to create those kinds of acts for ostensibly consumer protection or privacy purposes or whatever, just make sure that your companies can still export, because that's a key part of the future. And so we just need to be really cautious when we create what seems like a very sweeping, great for our domestic consumer potentially market idea that ends up stymieing the ability of exports and imports to compete.
오케이. 시간이 좀 늦어지고 있고요. 제가 이제 모두의 약속을 드린 바 있어요. 그 방청석에서 질문을 이제 받겠다 했는데 사실은 오늘 이 패널 디스커션 세팅 자체는 방청석 질문에는 그렇게 프렌들리하지 않은 그런 세션이긴 합니다. 하지만 그럼에도 불구하고 제가 이제 말씀을 드렸기 때문에 예의상 딱 질문 하나만 받아보겠습니다. 질문이 있으시면 손 들어주시고요. 그리고 성명하고 소속 뭐 이렇게 말씀을 미리 해주시면 좋겠습니다. 예. 마이크 좀 부탁드립니다.
요약해서 바로 말씀드리겠습니다.
요지만 간단히 해주시죠.
이 패널 분들께서는 조금 추상적인 개념에서 자꾸 접근하시는 것 같고, 제가 일반 사용자로서 제안드리고자 하는 것은, 우리가 물류 혁신이 일어난 게 컨테이너 베이스가 생기면서 물류 혁신이 일어났듯이 이 디지털 거래 자체를 개량화하는 방법을 빨리 규정을 해주시면 그 개량화된 걸 가지고 법률이나 이런 국가 간의 트레이드나 과세관계나 이런 걸 하면은 표준이 딱 바로 되기 때문에 100% 만족은 안 하더라도 70%의 만족을 가지고 빨리 확장될 수 있는 것이 되지 않을까 싶습니다. 즉 예를 들면 그로스 웨이트라든지 네트 웨이트라든지 킬로그램당 단가에 따라서 이 디지털 트레이드를 어느 식으로 각국의 규정을 이렇게 하도록 한다라고 WTO나 어떤 주관이 진행을 되면 각 나라의 세수나 뭐 디지털 화폐나 이런 데에 대한 저항 세력을 잠재울 수 있지 않을까 이렇게 생각합니다.
예, 고맙습니다. He just suggested the necessity of compilation of relevant data for like logistics data, and you wanna reply to that?
I'll reply very quickly. I think sometimes we make this too complicated. I mean, digital trade is trade. So a lot of our existing trade rules, and I think we're going to discuss this in the next panel, a lot of our existing trade rules actually cover digital trade. What's the difference between digitally delivered something and delivered something? Sometimes it looks the same. So I think we need to be careful that we're not like throwing out all of our past efforts in goods, services, investment, intellectual property rights, et cetera, in our quest to create digital or digital-only agreements and say our trade rules actually work quite well. And what we need to do is think about maybe what are the, if any, adjustments we need to make to more clearly cover digitally delivered whatever it is or digitally enabled. With the big caveat, almost everything is digital. It's got digital inputs, it's got digital outputs. So increasingly we have to think about trade with a digital element. Now there are a few things that are distinctive to digital, but overall we need to not forget that digital trade is trade, and maybe our trade rules actually are mostly fine, and we really only need to focus on a few key issues. And the rest we just adapt, we continue to adapt, or we clarify where the digital element might make a difference. And not try to imagine an entirely new world of something called digital trade that is different from traditional trade.
Thank you so much. 우리 그 세션이 이제 예정에 비해서 한 7 내지 8분 정도 이렇게 지연돼서 시작을 했거든요. 그래서 지금 예정 시간을 지나고는 있는데 이미 지연돼서 시작된 점을 고려할 때 제가 아무런 맺은말 없이 끝내는 것이 적절하진 않은 것 같고 저로서도 아쉬움은 남을 것 같고 해서 제 이제 마지막 맺은말을 하고 패널 디스커션을 끝내려고 합니다. Well, I think that's is a good timing for me to make a few closing remarks. On my note and on your note as well, there are underpinning principles for freer, more inclusive, and more secure digital trade. The first one is non-discrimination in every possible sense. The second is balancing, a matter of testing proportionality, as Dr. Elms and Professor Peng has mentioned. The third one is neutrality. It now covers technological or network neutrality, but we have to pay attention to the growing voice that the scope needs extending beyond them, like interoperability or platform neutrality, that kind of things. I believe that the best approach in digital age is not that unlike the one prevailing in the pre-digital age. That said, it boils down to how to live with those principles in the digital age. We have been trying since 1998 to adapt those principles to this revolutionary ecosystem, mostly outside the WTO. Despite the progress made to date, there still remains a significant number of gray areas. Dismissing them, we are doomed to run the risk of digital balkanization. We have witnessed in the session all the panel members, with almost one voice, have expressed serious concern of that kind. Ignoring the risk any further, waiting us is the world of chronic divergence, ironically in the cyber-physical convergence era. In conclusion, I should like to mark on two quotes. United we stand, divided we fall, and the sooner the better. The venue is in Geneva. Thank you all for your valuable inputs and for staying through the session. I hereby close the first session.